I think people thought I was crazy when I was doing this because, like, when you think of brain model, you think it has to have like sort of like a lot of complexity to it. This is really like a simple cognitive model. We used to sit around in graduate school, like in the late 90s, and with professors and students and talk about the big picture. Everybody thought it would be 200 years before we had any models that could like do object recognition.
This is Brain Inspired.
Hey everyone, I'm Paul Middlebrooks, and today I speak with Bradley Love. Brad's a professor at University College London and a fellow at the Alan Turing Institute. You'll hear he has a lot of interests. One of the things he's worked on for years is a model to understand how we learn and store concepts. You may remember I had Rodrigo Quiroga on recently, who discovered concept cells in the human hippocampus, which respond when someone is presented with a specific concept, no matter how that concept is presented. So, if that concept is Bradley Love, it could be a picture of him taken from any angle, it could be his written name, and so on. And after today, after you learn about the sustain model that captures how concepts are learned and that maps onto particular brain regions encoding these concepts, your concept neuron for Brad will fire when you think of the sustain model. How meta can you get? So we talk about concepts and his now decades-old model that keeps chugging along. We talk about his cognitive modeling approach to understanding brains and intelligence. And we talk about some of his recent work integrating deep learning models into the study of concepts, plus a few of his other deep learning projects. It's a long episode, but it actually was even longer. This is the first episode for which I saved a segment just for Brain Inspired supporters on Patreon, which I'll start doing more often and posting some extra bonus episodes for Patreon supporters as well. So if it sounds like this episode cuts off a bit abruptly at the end, that's because it's missing the last half hour or so, where we discuss Brad's outlook on AI and some of his wisdom and advice from his own experiences. Eric, Johan, Byung, Ruslan, Howard, and Dennis, or Denis, thank you for your recent support on Patreon, and you can expect that bonus episode very soon. Find show notes at braininspired.co, where you can also learn how to support the show for super cheap. Now, this was a fun episode for me, and I hope that you enjoy. Brad Love. Brad, I have inspired you to actually connect your analog guitar and microphone system board to your digital Mac computer finally, so you're welcome.
Thank you. You're the only one that apparently could get me to do this after it's sitting around a year, so I'm indebted to you before the show even starts.
What's our band name going to be?
Brainiac's already taken, so I don't know, Brainiac Jr.
I think Joseph Ledoux has a band, I think, called the Amygdaloids, maybe. I don't know if you've heard them.
Yeah, I've heard of them for sure. I've probably heard them too. A couple of times I had the pleasure of making a guest appearance in another cognitive neuroscience band, Pavlov's Dog.
Oh, man.
So
that's awesome.
I'm definitely not a musical person, but yeah, years ago I enjoyed playing in like a scrappy lo-fi band, but as a, kind of hobby, but that fell by the wayside. But maybe in lockdown, since you've inspired me to hook this up, I'll dust off the guitar.
But you are sitting there with a Fender t-shirt on. You've got, I can see a Fender guitar, or at least a electric guitar in the background. So I'm ready, man. I'm ready to go when we're done here. So.
All right.
Yeah.
I better keep my day job.
Yeah. Well, I don't have a day job, so I need something. So Brad, anyway, welcome to the show. It's good to have you on, and thanks for being here.
Oh, thanks so much for having me.
There's a lot for us to talk about, and I thought we might just start with your kind of philosophical approach to neuroscience and cognitive science. I call everything neuroscience, by the way, so hopefully that you can get used to that. Your philosophical approach and tying it into the whole idea of Marr's levels and approaching cognition and neuroscience through different levels. So I don't know, how would you just describe your philosophical approach to studying intelligence? I don't know if I can ask a broader question than that.
Oh no, sure. I mean, maybe I'll like jump into like the neuroscience approach first, but yeah, I mean, I've always been found working with computational models very helpful just for organizing my ideas, and they could also surprise you what they actually predict, which is really what you predict, what your theory predicts. So I've kind of found that formalization process helpful. In particular, I found it helpful to work with relatively simple models that like I refer to as cognitive models that would be at Marr's algorithmic level. So, like really briefly, and I'm sure your listeners know, but like, computational level is the top level. That's sort of the what, like what's the input output function, and the algorithmic level is like how, what steps do you go through, what processes and representations do you use? And of course, below that's the implementational level, which is like the where. But I found working with pretty simple cognitive models helpful to like kind of distilling the basic principles I'm interested in. And I found them to be like a really useful lens on brain data. Like, so we've done with like really good collaborators like Tyler Davis and Ali Preston and Mike Mack and others, like work using these models to link them to like bold response and fMRI. So it makes it a little bit more theoretical because you kind of take this more like top-down view on the data. And it could be really useful for capturing like processes that you think are happening through time within a trial or across learning trials. So it's sort of like a middle out approach, I guess would be the philosophy. It's not really starting from the top or the bottom, but somewhere in the middle as a bridge between like the higher and lower levels.
So the idea that there hasn't been enough theory in neuroscience, I don't know. I've been hearing that a lot, maybe over the past 10 years. I'm sure, who knows really when it started becoming more and more vocal. But I feel like just as an observer, I see a ton of focus and focus on and celebration of higher levels within Marr's level. So either on the computational level or on the algorithmic level. Especially these days, it seems like the algorithmic level, is the right way to approach this, or at least it's celebrated as such. I mean, do you think that the algorithmic level has gained too much celebratory acceptance? From my perspective, it's like the recent 10 years have been like, oh, poor brains. They often seem completely left out of this whole endeavor.
I mean, I'm not sure. If you just look like not so many years ago, like in the 2000s, it was like quite the opposite, right? Like, so that was like, in terms of more cognitive science, rational Bayesian theories that are at the computational level were all the rage. So at that level, there actually isn't any notion of mental process or representation. And if you look in cognitive neuroscience, I mean, there was so much like, there's interesting work, but it's like largely like, fMRI blobology where like, you're just doing these contrasts that aren't linked to any like cognitive model at the algorithmic level. So, I mean, if there's been this like rise in interest in the algorithmic level, it's fairly recent because, I mean, definitely then most of neuroscience wasn't model-based and most of computational modeling was like Bayesian rational. But it makes sense that, to bring these things together, it's what a lot of people would say, you want to have like multi-level theorizing. So it makes sense that people would get interested in the how of cognition to kind of link things together. So I don't think the brain's, being left behind. I mean, I'm certainly interested in using constraints from neural measures to inform the cognitive models. But the cognitive models really let you see things in the brain data that you couldn't otherwise reveal. So like almost in every study we've published, if we just do a standard contrast or something, like, we don't really see much that's interesting. And it's really like the models are helping to reveal these things that aren't like, super obvious, because most of what we're interested in are like theoretical things, like even like error correction, updating. These are like theoretical things you need a model to characterize, or recognition strength, or familiarity. Like you need and they're changed through time, both within a trial and across trials if you're looking at learning studies. So I think the models are really allied with the neuroscience.
You have this sustained model that we'll eventually talk about here, and you've been working on using this model and applying it to brain data as well, and sort of mapping on its processes to hippocampus and prefrontal cortex. And we won't go through the whole thing right here, but so you have used your algorithmic level approach to map on to the implementation level as well. So, I mean, this is something you've been doing for a long time. You mentioned the Bayesian approach, and you've actually been in the past been critical of the Bayesian brain idea, like you were just talking. So the Bayesian brain idea is that brain circuits represent and process information as probability distributions, right? So, it's often used as a normative approach without enough connection to actual brain processing, is sort of a rough and dirty summary of in your brain and behavioral sciences article. But so that was a little while ago. Do you think that the Bayesian approach has come down from the strict computational level, and has it gotten better since you suggested it wasn't connected enough with the algorithmic level?
I think, I don't want to pat myself on the back, but I think so a bit. I mean, I think it's got more interesting. So I think we were a little bit misconstrued. We were never anti-Bayesian, and both Matt and I publish papers that take Bayesian approaches, and sort of the sustained successor that's under perpetual review with Kurt Bronlick is has the same basic principles as the original model, but it's in a more Bayesian formalization. Well, I guess what we're really critical of is just leaving behind the other levels of analysis, because really, if you stick to the computational level, you're just leaving behind so many constraints, everything about the how of cognition and the neuroscience. I mean, just loads of other other endeavors as well. So there's nothing wrong with or special with Bayes' rule, right? So you could have an algorithmic model which is Bayes' rule. You could say that's actually the process people use. That's actually the representation people use. So even those models don't have to stick strictly to the computational level. So that's really what we're critical of. So there's not really any strong claim that the brain doesn't keep track of uncertainty or probability distributions or anything like that. It was really an appeal to kind of leave this sort of rational perch and get down and dirty a little bit with psychology and neuroscience.
Down and dirty with psychology and neuroscience. You might have just written the title for this episode. We'll see. So tied into this idea of levels. So there's Marr's famous levels that we've just been talking about, but a maybe complementary approach, I want to say, is a mechanistic account. This is most recently probably, it's been written about by Carl Craver and William Bechtel, and basically to approach neuroscience and cognitive science, using a mechanistic approach. And to really, just to summarize it, a mechanism consists of parts of things, and those parts' operation and their organization, together with the constraints that the environment imposes and what kind of environment it's in. But the idea is that when you break a process down into its mechanism, that the mechanism actually can bridge different levels of Marr's levels hierarchically. You can use a mechanism to look at a level above, look at the computational level, for instance, and look at the level below. I mean, do you see merit in the mechanistic approach? And, do you think it's complementary with Marr's approach?
Yeah, no, interesting question. It seems like the levels of mechanism approach is well suited to neuroscience. I mean, if you think of something, like you said, like a car or something, it has components like an engine and brakes and a radio, and all those components, of course, can be decomposed themselves, right? So the engine has a lot of components, but I think what's nice about it, maybe for scientists, is that it's just because you're talking about a car at the level of car, something higher level, it's not like you say, oh, that's not real because you're describing the engine just in terms of torque and horsepower, not going into all its components. So I think, it might, taking that sort of language might do away with some conceptual confusions, and in science, and it kind of moves people towards away from laws and thinking about systems. I think one thing in terms of whether it's complementary to Marr's levels, I think one thing it kind of leaves out is the computational level, because the computational level isn't really concerned with mechanism. It's concerned more with like the problem description, like what's the input output mapping, like literally like what's the function you're trying to solve. So like if we were doing like sorting, it would just be like description of the problem, sort the numbers in order. Whereas the algorithmic level would be like what's the algorithm, what series of steps you go through to sort the numbers. So I don't really know if that's like really like present in the levels of mechanism so much.
The way I've read it described is that it is actually separate from sort of the computational or functional in terms of the levels of mechanism nomenclature. It would be called the function, right? And that function and mechanism actually mutually inform each other. So there is a distinction between, if you want to equate function with computational level, there is a distinction in this literature of the mechanistic levels approach between function and mechanism, but that they mutually inform each other.
Oh yeah, no, I could see that, but like it seems like the computational level. I mean, I think maybe I'm just being like too strict, and of course, like I should go through this more carefully. But it's like, I mean, it's really, to give a computational level account, you really have to like characterize the full range of like possible inputs, and like I'm not sure like people working with mechanisms are thinking about that. This isn't really at all a criticism of it. I mean, there's almost like this sort of kind of like teleological thing to the computational level, like what's the purpose or this. Yeah. And like, I kind of like taking that perspective sometimes a step back, but it could be like a creature of the human mind that this level. But I mean, I think it could be a useful perspective to take from time to time. But yeah, I mean, what I like about the levels of mechanism too, that you mentioned, is that like, you don't really have these sort of monolithic levels, like, there's just no end in sight. So you realize there is no bottom to it. So I think it could reduce some chauvinism in levels. And it makes clearer, I think, what people are trying to explain in terms of how much they unpack the mechanisms in terms of the constituent parts. Yeah.
Yeah. One way that it's been put to me, and this was from John Krakauer, I think, a long time ago now. And I don't remember if it was actually on the podcast or I met with him and had a beer, and it might have just been over a beer. But he didn't say specifically this with respect to levels of mechanism, but we were talking about Marr's level, which he's essentially a proponent of. And he was suggesting that a lot of people make the mistake that of applying Marr's levels to like size in the brain, right? So implementation is like neurons, whereas the algorithmic level we need to think of as bigger circuits. And then the computational level is like a functional brain or like the functional. So it maps onto these like physically larger things. And his point to me was that you can apply Marr's levels at every single different level of physical size. So in that sense, with the levels of mechanism approach, the one way it could be complementary is at every level of mechanism, you can still apply the three sorts of Marr's levels of analysis approaches at each level. So I'm not sure if that makes complete sense.
Yeah, I mean, like Marr's levels, I mean, I find that they're still like helpful in many ways for like understanding one's contribution. But yeah, it makes sense to, try to slice them more or apply them in particular contexts like you're suggesting. Because I mean, you can't just like lump all of neuroscience into like one level. And I mean, Marr's levels are really sort of like, borrowed from abstraction hierarchies and computer science. And, where the top level there would be like the application, the bottom level would be like below circuits to like physics pretty much. And so there you have like so many like levels you could, traverse along the way more than three. And you could see how they're all related and how there's like more of a richness and detail as you descend. Yeah, so it makes sense that like, I mean, I think it's just like a good guidance to think about like what your intellectual contribution is. And yeah, so it makes sense that that's not like where you would want to stop, like you're suggesting.
You've written that you think both reduction and emergence are misguided as concepts. So, what are your views on emergence and reduction if you had to sort of boil it down?
Yeah, it's funny you ask. Like, so I kind of went on my own little like personal intellectual like odyssey, like writing a recent paper that's like just putting the final touches on it before it hits print. And like a lot of what I believed before writing the paper like changed, because I think like a lot of times you hear like, oh, emergence, that's cool. It's like, it's like the anthill. It just happens, and it's really that's how things work. It just emerges. Like we don't things that don't just emerge aren't really interesting mechanisms or models. Or reduction. Oh, that's really bad. It's just like you just gotta be more open-minded and not. But like if you really think about these things, like emergence, like how people say it, it doesn't really make a lot of sense. And a lot of what people describe as emergent just really isn't. Like so, if you take things like cellular automata, like Conway's game of life, from the initial conditions, it could generate all these like fascinating patterns, but there's really just simple local rules and being applied that are generating them. I mean, it's obviously being simulated on a computer. And likewise, when you think of flocking behavior with birds, again, like each little agent has some simple rules of behavior that apply locally. And so when we say it emerges, we're just really saying we're not that smart and we can't like simulate the whole thing in our head and appreciate it. I mean, it's sort of like saying if I bump my mug of water and it falls off the floor, it's like, oh, the glass broke and emerged from me hitting it and it fell. It's like, no, it's like I could appreciate this. And like if we took a space alien, that was like way smarter, it'd be like nothing emerged, in Conway's game of life or the flocking behavior. And basically, if you could simulate it on a computer, you're like breaking it down to like the components that are generating whatever the higher level observed behavior. And so it's like the higher level behavior is like completely like reducible to like smaller elements interacting. So like, yeah, I mean, we could use that in like common language, but I think it's like a little slippery and it could lead to like conceptual confusions. I mean, like I had the pleasure as an undergraduate of like briefly studying under Jaegwon Kim, this like philosopher of mind that introduced this really useful notion of supervenience. And there's many varieties of it, and they're all formalized like really well. But like the basic idea is like if something supervenes with something else, you can't have a change in the higher level thing without some change in the lower level thing. So you couldn't have like a change in mental state without some change in physical state, and that's pretty commonsensical unless you believe in like ghosts or something. But when you start talking about emergence, you're going to have like mental states like causing mental states, and then what's the physical states aren't causing them, or you have like overdetermination, like you have like two causes, or you get like downward causation, like all these really weird things if you actually like work through it and think through it or read literatures I'm not expert in philosophy. It just kind of leads to like a little bit of incoherence, or at least debate, like whereas if you just kind of stick with it's practically emerging, it's not really emerging. It's like, it's just like a limit of like human cognition and our ability to analyze data or the quality of the data, as opposed to things aren't reducible. I mean, by the same token, like reduction is like sort of like this strange bias scientists have, because usually I think scientists confuse that things like probably can reduce all the way down to like particles, like everything is like at some level of physics. I think they confuse that with that is practically possible to do or even desirable. Because it's not like right now we're like, oh, how do we help small businesses in this economic crisis? Let's talk to a particle physicist. Like you would never do that.
Well, I think a particle physicist would beg to differ because they believe they have the solution to everything, right?
Oh yeah, of course. I guess there's an icing model for it or something. But like, but I just meant like, I guess that's the wrong thing because maybe they could actually help, but not by like modeling it at like quarks and stuff.
Right.
But yeah, so I think people confuse that. And like, so, I mean, there's a reason like neuroscience itself is like a higher level discipline, even the lowest level parts of it. Right. And, and it's not going away. And like economics isn't going away. Like all these fields aren't going away because they're like useful and practically we can't reduce it. It doesn't mean like in principle, like it's not possible or like some super intelligent, agent couldn't reduce it down. But practically speaking, it's just not reducing. And like most of neuroscience isn't like formal or understood enough to reduce anyway. So, I mean, I just wish we would just kind of focus on what people are trying to explain, like what's the relevant data, what are the relevant findings, and how good of a job they do like actually explaining that data. And then like a lot of these like sort of debates, even discussion of levels, a lot of it just kind of melts away by just being a little bit more clear about those things.
My own personal comfort level as a neuroscientist, like I decided at some point, okay, I feel comfortable not worrying about membrane proteins at synapses and their kinematics. And so I don't need to understand it at that level, even though someone who studies that could say, well, we wouldn't have thoughts if we didn't have membrane proteins at synapses. It's like, that's my favorite thing of any sort of explanatory go-to. It's like, in any sort of documentary, it's like water. We would not exist without water, and it's always like, oh my God, it must be the most important thing ever, water. And it's very important. It's true, So particle physics, we would not, of course, you can explain it. You can reduce anything to a certain level. But your view, so then on emergence is basically emergence is our way of describing things, just at the level that we can understand things and describe things to make sense to us as humans, because we cannot simulate every little minute detail. So we have to be comfortable with a certain level of description, and that's sort of what emergence is.
It could be like, so basically there's sort of like this weak emergence, or like practical emergence, or like maybe a philosopher call it like epistemic or something, like where it's exactly what you said. It's not like saying things don't reduce down to like something lower level. Like in principle, it's just saying like, practically we just can't do it because we're not smart enough. We don't have the right data or the right tools. So I think people should be careful, because a lot of times it sounds like they're making a stronger claim about like the world or like, the brain or something, and as opposed to a claim about where we are in our science.
Okay, so one more thing before we move on here to concepts and switch gears. You don't like the term biological plausibility. I'm not just trying to bring out all your qualms here, but you don't like that term conceptually. What would you replace it with? Why don't you like it, and what would you replace it with?
Boy, I really don't like a lot of things. It's like we
can talk about lots of things that you like. Yeah.
No, I just like more things than I like. You've picked up on that. It's like, I think, so recently, this recent paper I mentioned, like levels of biological plausibility, just basically state the reasons why I think it's a completely like vacuous, misleading, and incoherent concept. I mean, what are we really studying? Like stepping back, like we're trying to determine what is biologically plausible. So like just asserting it is almost like assuming the answer. But I think worse than that, it's really something in the eye of the beholder. And again, like what I was emphasizing before, one really has to be clear about like what findings and data they're trying to explain. So I give this like example in the paper. Like imagine you have this one model, this deep convolutional network, and it explains activity along the ventral stream like really effectively. And so they're like, hey, we're biologically plausible. We explain the ventral stream activity. And these other people are like, no, our model's like biologically plausible because we don't use backpropagation, and our learning rule is consistent with pyramidal like cell activity. And it's like, okay, so are they both biologically plausible? Is neither? They're both justifying their publication in terms of biological plausibility. What's really going on is like, it's like they basically care about different data sources or findings, and they're explaining the data they care about, which is fine. They're basically like, so why don't we just like be a little bit more forthcoming with that and just say we're doing model selection. Model selection is very top down. You select the findings or even the data you care about, and then you could actually select, the best model for that data. So basically the two groups in my example are doing like different model selections on different data sets, different aspects of neuroscience. And so like, what is biological plausibility? It's nothing more than explaining the data you care about the best. So it does no work beyond that. So it's just really misleading, and it's been like abused through time. I mean, I kind of like resonate to the idea of making things that are biologically plausible. Like, who wouldn't? It sounds good. But then I kind of realized reading papers, a lot of papers, not all, some are great, but are just like really junk. And they're like, this paper's great because it's biologically plausible and it's better than that model. It's not. And I'm like, why? What is biologically plausible about your model? And it's like sort of face validity almost, like, so '80s, it'd be like connectionist models were biologically plausible because they had like a lot of little things in them, and the brain had a lot of little things in them, whereas like production systems weren't, because like you can't open up the brain and see like a lot of rules or something. But then, like subsequently, like what is like John Anderson and his colleagues do, like they apply like ACT-R production system to explaining bold response, doing mental arithmetic. So now is that model like still not biologically plausible? So I think it's sort of like contrary to multi-level theorizing, and just like whatever, just specify the relevant data sources that you're evaluating yourself against, do some model selection, and let's just like leave these like that. It's like not a helpful label, I don't think.
It's a badge that people wear to elevate, I guess, their research, perhaps. But it's interesting that you use backpropagation, and maybe this is where like so there's this big back and forth now in backpropagation specifically of whether it's biologically plausible, and maybe you've hit on the point that, so on the one hand, the idea of supervised learning and that synapses can adjust based on some feedback signal, is fine. And in that sense, quote unquote, backpropagation is biologically plausible. But, on the other hand, we don't have these symmetric connections between neurons. So backpropagation, as it's done in connectionist, networks, is physically impossible because it doesn't exist in brains and therefore is not biologically plausible on that level. But these two things are somewhat addressing different levels, like you said.
Yeah, I mean, it could be different levels or even just different aspects of data at the same level. Like when you make a model or a theory of something, you don't try to explain everything about the brain or behavior. And so like it's totally fine to have like a theory of the ventral stream and just be like, well, we're not explaining why the connections aren't symmetrical, but we're explaining like these aspects of the data or findings, or because no model explains everything about the brain. So yeah, so I just think this like label is unhelpful because it makes it almost like you are or you aren't. It's almost like a way to like rule out approaches when no approach explains all the data anyway. So like if we just do this enough, we could make everything not biologically plausible. It doesn't. So
yeah. I mean, I guess it also depends on how you define, backpropagation in this context. But there's also a lot of back and forth about what deep learning is, and there are people who practice deep learning that have a definition, and it seems like the definition changes to include more and more things. And people, there's a new finding, and people say, "Well, that's deep learning." There's a new finding in the brain. Oh, well, that's deep learning. Deep learning covers that, and all of a sudden, somehow, the deep learning definition expands, and so in the end, deep learning wins somehow. So I don't know. There's this back and forth.
Oh, no, definitely. I mean, this is like, I'm not even that old, and this has been going on my entire life, when I was kind of getting into this, it was like connectionism was like the sort of like Uber theory. But of course, like connectionism isn't a theory, it's like a framework for building theories of models. It's like saying I have a theory, it's called Python, it's like, and then of course, Bayesian models aren't a theory. It's like, it's like a really broad framework for building models and theories. And so, I mean, deep learning is just the same. I mean, it's not really, it has some like associated characteristics, but you could build like very different deep learning theories of like the same like phenomenon. So like, it's not really a theory. That's not like being negative. I mean, it's an amazing, and you could build amazing theories from it. It's just not a theory. It's like a framework.
It's a tool, a framework. Yeah.
Yeah.
Brad, you really don't like polka music. Why do you not like? No, I'm just kidding. Let's switch gears and talk about something that you like. So,
sure.
I just interviewed Rodrigo Kian Quiroga, who is sort of famous for discovering concept cells, and we talked a lot about concept cells and also about lots of other things in this recent book.
I really dislike Friends. Just kidding. Sorry.
Yeah. Right. So just to sort of recap, though, concepts and concept learning has been your bread and butter for a long time now. And, you've, like I said, you had this sustained model that models how we learn concepts, how they're formed, and how they map onto brains, and lots of other things. But so I'd love to just talk about concepts and concepts learning, and
Sure.
maybe you can just define what a concept is for people who missed it last time.
Sure. I mean, hard to do. So concepts, I mean, you could tie it to generalization, which of course every creature that has to make decisions does. Like, like a dog generalizes, it has a concept of its owner. If its owner changes her clothes or haircut, like still the owner. I mean, the way I think about concepts is that it's not in any particular place in the processing stream, but it has to be it's some kind of intermediary between perception and action, and it has the ability to somewhat decouple from both. And so like what I mean is like if you think of something like a zebra, if you like remove its stripes, you're changing sort of like your perception of it, but it's still a zebra just because you painted the thing. You have some concept of the zebra that persists. Likewise, if the action you have to take in regards to something changes, like say yesterday the price of oil like went to negative $40 like in the US. So like there it becomes something like, oh, I'm gonna pull this out of the ground and sell it and get rich. And it's like, oh God, I gotta pay someone to take it away. It really changes like how you view it and deal with it, but you're still oil. It still have the same concept of oil. So it's sort of like this nice intermediary that could link perception and action and decouple them in some ways as like the perceptions and the relevant actions change. So I guess in terms of like you mentioned sustain, in terms of like clustering models, all these models, they get some like intermediate representation. So in that model, it has clusters that collapse together related experiences. And so you could think of those as the concepts in some sense that like identify sort of the relevant perceptual chunks and link them to responses, naming, for example. So like it wouldn't confuse concepts with words. You could have many different sort of little conceptual chunks that map on to the same name or the same action.
Well, so concepts in general, though, are kind of an abstraction then from, like you said, from sensorial perception and from actions, responses related to the perceptions. So in that sense, I don't know, it seems like a very high cognitive human skill. Like where would you place abstraction in the hierarchy of human abilities?
I would place it nowhere special. I mean, like again, like every animal that makes decisions has to do this. So like, I mean, just like I said, like your dogs have concepts. Pigeons show peak shift behavior, like where you kind of generalize the pattern. Because I mean, what I'm saying is just like kind of sort of like psychology 101, but like, we never really run across the same exact situation or stimulus twice. So like, I mean, you got to have some notion. I mean, I don't know. I mean, people could probably link this up with more, I don't think it exactly maps on with more like sort of model-based learning. I mean, I don't think it's like really special human ability.
But so are there different, just pushing on this a little bit because Rodrigo, is pretty adamant that concepts and like super abstraction sort of lead, like you said, lead to generalization, and that our level of abstraction, our level of creating concepts divorced from their perceptions and actions and their connection with lots of different areas in our brain, lots of different functions, are what give rise to our special human experience, right? So are there different levels of abstraction that still count as concepts, right? So we have maybe different levels of abstractions of concepts?
Yeah, no, that's a great question. I mean, certainly, like, I don't want to like devalue that people have a reasoning and abstraction abilities, that aren't seen in other species. But I just don't really see them as like, maybe we just got like a couple of the levers and knobs turned exactly right to like, eke a bit more out. But it doesn't seem like there's really like a qualitative, like a huge step. I mean, people argue about this forever, and there's BBS papers about this. But if you look at our abstract reasoning abilities, they always have remnants of like more concrete knowledge or processes in them. So for example, if you teach people some rule, they could state the rule, but when they apply the rule, it'll be affected by the similarity of the test item to the previous training items. People could do abstract reasoning like deduction, but like how often they make errors is a function of how believable the conclusion is, which has nothing to do with logic, right? So abstract reasoning, if this, then that, if that, then that. It shouldn't matter what the P's and Q's are, but it does, and how well people reason. That's why people, like Chang and Holake talk about pragmatic reasoning schemas. I think that's like from way back in the 80s or something. But everything's like this. Memory retrieval's like this. So like, why don't we make really distant analogies? Like you have all these great analogies in the history of science, but in practice, like we always just make analogies from like the domain we're working in to the same domain or one really next to it, because memory's guided by like surface features that guide retrieval, right? Like, so that's usually what's relevant. So like all these things are there's a very concrete underbelly to like our abstract symbol processing. It's all highly contextual. And like, so even like when you do some kind of variable binding, if you think of it that way, like, like if someone says, I love my child, I love chocolate, like love just changed meaning, based on like what took that slot, if you think of it that way. I'm not saying we can't do like symbol processing or abstract reasoning, but it's not actually really that abstract. There's always sort of this underbelly which suggests it's not completely abstract in some sense or divorced. Maybe we just have like, we just got like, not like the secret sauce, but just like the settings like a little bit better just to get a little bit farther than like other animals. But it doesn't seem like a night and day thing. And yeah, to me.
Yeah, I mean, it's an interesting question whether adding just a little bit more of something fundamentally changes the nature of what you can do with that thing, right? So you're talking about symbol processing and we have language, and that is a very uniquely human thing. And is there something qualitatively different about the way we process that enables us to have language? The way that I see it, I barely have language. I barely have symbol processing. I don't know how you feel about it, but it's not like we have opened ourselves up and can explore this eternal new space of processing with symbol processing, for instance. To me, it's very easily conceivable that we are still, like you said, using the same sorts of processes and grounded in that same, evolutionary system, essentially, and not doing that much different, but it's different enough that there's a different quality to it.
Yeah, no, I mean, that's the way I view it. I'm sure like some language people get very upset with me, but it's just, it's like another like representational format you could use, or it's like another cue to meaning. A lot of times when people like kind of invoke language, it could actually disrupt their processing. So like in learning studies, you ask people what they're doing and they convert what they're actually doing into a description, and they start doing their description, which is actually like maladaptive. So, I mean, it's not like, language could be useful. Obviously, we were using it right now to communicate. I mean, I don't know if it's correct, but like I think a lot of what drives people, I'm sure there's like special things about our brains, but it's also like we've built these really like complex environments for ourselves that I think spur our development, and we have these great ways of like building on the complexity from other people have figured out and passing it along. So I mean, in some sense, right, like the convolutional networks, why do they work okay but not perfectly now? It's because they have these like richer data sets to train on. And, if they had more tasks to do, people are exploring things like self-supervised learning, more auxiliary tasks to do with it, more ways of interacting, basically ways of just linking things together and making it richer. I think that is a lot of what drives like intelligence, is not the device, but like the input and the interaction and the richness of it. It's like you can't really have like someone become super smart that gets no interesting input or has no interesting interactions with the world. So I think we discount that. We always think about like the device and not sort of the whole like world it's embedded in and how complex the world is that we've made for ourselves. That's all like, crashing down a little right now. But, we build these really, really complex environments, and we have really complex social interactions with each other. And it just builds and builds over generations. And so, I mean, that's not the whole story, but that has to be part of the story of why we're different.
Okay, so just getting back to concepts, because we could talk about our unique human abilities and what is unique and what's not. We could talk about that forever. So, but let's take a step back. Like I said, I just talked with Rodrigo about concepts, and he found these concept cells in the hippocampus, Jennifer Aniston neurons, as people like to call them. And we already know, as you mentioned, you do not like Friends. However, these concept cells do exist in the brain. You record the cell and it responds to just invariant representations of, in this case, a person, Jennifer Aniston. No matter if you write her name or show her picture, she could be at any different orientation, et cetera, et cetera. But what we didn't talk is about how those concept cells come to respond that way. In other words, how concepts are learned. And that is something that you've been working on for a long time with your sustain model, which I've already mentioned a few minutes ago. But I wonder if you could just kind of take us through, what the sustain model is and how it addresses how concepts are learned and how they're updated and even stored.
Sure. Yeah, it'd be my pleasure. This work goes all the way back to the 90s, and the idea was to build a model that could move between two extremes. So on one extreme, you have a prototype representation where you really just have like one node in memory for like that collapses all your experiences of a category together. So like you'd have one node in memory for birds. The other extreme model would be the exemplar model, where you would store like a node in memory for each experience. So everything would leave a trace. So there'd actually be no abstraction in memory. Instead, you do the abstraction at the time of decision by like activating all these traces. So clustering models like navigate those two extremes, and the key to them is like, well, when do you collapse information together and store it, form some kind of abstraction? And the way sustain works, it seems like how people do more and more like over the years, including at the level of like brain activity, is that it assumes simplicity. So it basically assumes that experiences like collapse together or somewhat, like average together in memory until there's some kind of surprising prediction error that's relevant to the task you're doing. So the example I always use in talks is like you're learning about birds and mammals, and you see a bat for the first time, and it's small and it has wings and flies, and so you call it a bird, but that is surprisingly incorrect. So now you make this new node, like centered on that error. So now that could like kind of evolve into its own kind of bat concept or prototype.
How does that map onto the idea of a cluster?
Yeah, so these little nodes are the clusters. So the clusters are they're just representations in your head that are like running averages of the running information. So like the key is there's really like two kinds of updates when you have a new experience. You could either have like kind of an incremental update, like say you have a cluster for cows in your head and you see a cow that's 2% bigger than your cow cluster, so you'll just slightly adjust your expectation upwards of how big cows are, right? So you just incrementally adjust that cow cluster. There's no real surprising error there. Whereas if you have some kind of like serious prediction error, like we mentioned with like realizing bat is not a bird, then you'll make a whole new node, basically in memory, a whole new cluster. It's really interesting. It's not published yet, but it should be a preprint soon. Like working with Mike Mack, we actually ran the study that was like so crazy. So to back up, we've been using this model for like a decade to like interrogate hippocampal and medial prefrontal activity. It's been doing a really good job, and we just keep pushing it farther and farther to now this thing that we haven't published yet is so ridiculous. Like we really are saying like, can we tag behaviorally from the model, like when someone's doing one of these incremental updates versus like forming a whole new cluster in memory or recruiting a new cluster, if you want to think of it that way. And it's really just driven by like the order of examples and really like minute things. But surprisingly, like there is like a signature of that in the brain, and like Mike Mack's done a really good job of like relating it to like this monosynaptic versus trisynaptic pathways that I think like Anna Shapiro discussed on one of your previous podcasts, basically like kind of fast learning and slow learning. So like, I don't know, we've done so many other things with this model and like characterizing brain response that I'm excited about. But this is actually just kind of seems ridiculous that like you come up with this cognitive model like in the 90s and it does a good job with behavior. And then in 2005, start thinking about, well, what is this computation like kind of relate to in terms of brain systems, thinking about patient studies and animal lesion studies and so on. And then just like kind of coming up with this characterization of these relatively simple computations in the model and how they might relate to the brain. Then like kind of fleshing that out in model-based fMRI, it actually works. It's really strange.
Yeah, maybe we should talk just how it does seem to map onto the brain. But, I should have mentioned that the concept cells were recorded in Hippocampus. and
oh yeah, this is grafted on the Hippocampus. Yeah.
Yeah, and one of the and the sustained model with your conceptual learning model maps onto partly onto the Hippocampus as well. So maybe you could spell out the rough and tumble of how the sustained model maps into the brain.
Yeah, I mean, first, it's really simple, like so much that I think people thought I was crazy when I was doing this, because like when you think of brain model, you think it has to have like sort of like a lot of complexity to it. This is really like a simple cognitive model. But anyway, this idea of like a cluster, just thinking about what is a cluster bundles together related experiences. So if you have a cluster, say to like encodes some surprising event like encountering a bat and it's a mammal, it's like binding together in memory like that it's small, it has wings, it flies, and it has fur. So it has to put all these things together. And to me, it seemed like a lot like the function of, say, like forming like an episodic memory where you have to bind together like all the elements and the context. But of course, like the hippocampus doesn't work in isolation. Like its connections with medial prefrontal cortex and other areas are crucial towards like orienting towards surprising events. And as we propose encoding like relevant information. So there's a notion of it like kind of attending to the relevant aspects of the situation. That's again, really simple and formalized. I mean, it's really that simple, but just that the cluster creation operation should be dependent on the hippocampus. We don't really get into like any sort of long-term consolidation. The hippocampus is like, not the most like anatomically stable region. And usually we end up studying things, not long-term over weeks and weeks or something.
Right.
But if you're looking at a concept learning study, you basically can see like what you would expect, like the kind of conceptual chunks or clusters that people should learn according to these clustering models, according to Sustain. You basically see the signature of them in the hippocampus, and you could even see like if you teach people like multiple sort of learning problems using the same stimulus, you could see like how the items coded differently in the hippocampus depending on whether people are doing sort of like one task or the other task. And you could also see its linkage, functional linkage. Basically, it's just correlation and bold response with like ventral medial prefrontal cortex, particularly early in learning when it has to like, the model is supposedly figuring out like what are the relevant aspects of the situation. And so it looks like sort of like kind of this top-down attention signal, figuring out what's relevant, is like that the hippocampus and ventral medial prefrontal cortex are cooperating, which is like a lot like the original theory. And like I'd be totally happy to be wrong. And we obviously like are learning a lot of new things. It's just kind of like, I don't know, it's kind of surprising this is like working out. It's nice.
Is the sustained model, has it changed at all over the years, or is it really still in its native original form?
Yeah, I mean, it hasn't changed at all. I mean, the model itself, again, it's ridiculously simple, but like it just keeps working. Like we could even account for like individual differences in like the representations and the attention weights of the model and relate them to like decoding information and like bold response. So it's like kind of like crossing individual differences in behavior and brain response. But yeah, the models, I mean, all models are really incomplete. And like, I think I mentioned, we have this newer model that takes the same principles, like namely like sort of assuming simplicity and then doing this like surprise-based coding. But it's more in like a Bayesian framework. But it's not really like your typical Bayesian model, because what it's trying to learn like affects what it samples and like what sort of clusters, what knowledge structures it builds, which is really like a critical aspect of sustain that at the time distinguished it from other clustering models like John Anderson's model, because it kind of got lost, but really a lot of the emphasis of that original psych review paper was that what you're trying to predict, like what the learner cares about, is going to shape what's acquired. So basically what discrimination one's trying to do is going to determine the internal model they build. So it's not doing like some kind of generic model building based on all the information available. It's very much tailored to the task at hand, which is a little bit goes back to our previous conversation that people really aren't like so abstract or complete in some sense. You know, it's still a little bit dirty, but yeah, I mean, the model really hasn't changed at all. Like not one bit. We just, there is a successor model, but all the principles are there. Just as more, it could account for like eye movements and information sampling ability. But it's really like the same theory, just like, you know, extended a bit because, you know, every model is really incomplete.
Yeah, I'm sort of laughing because it reminds me, I did work with Gordon Logan, who came up with the race model of response inhibition, which just basically posits that, you know, your decision of whether to move or not comes down to a race between internal processes of whether to move or not. And, you know, and we're like building like neural models, mechanistic accumulator models. And it's like every lab meeting, you know, that we'd have these ideas and there'd be Gordon just saying, the race model already accounts for that. And that was always the answer, you know, because it was like so deceptively simple, yet still accounts for so much. So.
Oh, no, I'm familiar with that work. Yeah, it's kind of beautiful. Yeah, it's like it's Scholl and Tom Palmieri and all these guys pursuing these related things. Yeah. I mean, there's a lot of models like that, sort of like the drift diffusion model. Like, I think like Radcliffe's psych review paper was from the late 70s, and it's sort of like was popular in mass psychology, but like, you know, it kind of sat fallow, and then like neuroscience like dusted it off, and it took off. But I guess like, I mean, maybe it's hopeful that even though the brain's really complicated in all its detail, to capture like some basic things, you know, there might just be some relatively straightforward, simple operations going on.
Yeah, hopefully it's not all just impossibly complex. Do you think that the formation of a concept, so like you said, you have you have your cluster of birds, your concept of birds, which is instantiated by this cluster, and then you see a bat, and you know, I don't know, maybe you're told it's not a bird, and that's very surprising, and then you have to make a new cluster, a new concept for a bat. Is that the same as the creation of new knowledge? Can we go that far?
Yeah, I mean, it's sort of carving the environment up, like which aspects are relevant to you, and it's almost like a reorganization of how one thinks about things. So yeah, I think you could call that new knowledge.
Well, but so you just said reorganization, which kind of puts it. So there's the idea of like, well, okay, then for a bat, you would put it into your mammal, you know, cluster or whatever, or things that are mammals but also bird-like, right? But you know, you might not necessarily have that cluster. So you could create a new cluster de novo, and therefore you could almost map it. I don't want to say ontologically, but as you know, to the creation of something new de novo knowledge. You know, does that make sense?
Yeah, no, I mean, it definitely, I think I'm just being like too concrete. It could be like the creation thing, like sounds like a big deal, but I mean, even right now, like with Rob Muck, we're working on like a version where basically each cluster is like a neuron. So the clusters themselves would have to be like, the units in the model would basically be like at the neuron level. So the cluster is almost like virtual or something. And then creating a cluster is really like changing the receptive properties of these units to like retune them. So, but it's still like, but at a higher level, it is still like creating a cluster. And I think it's really just kind of like partitioning the conceptual space up and showing that like, oh no, you thought that this whole region of space was all this one thing, but you actually have to put a split in there. And so you are learning something new about that part of conceptual space, that something's going on there that you didn't expect, like namely that these are actually strange flying mammals.
It still maps into your existing conceptual space at that point. It's not so surprising and so new that it's something that you would otherwise have never been able to think of, or, I'm not trying to push too much. I just, about the ontological nature of knowledge, but I'm kind of wondering how you conceive of it. So, yeah.
No, I mean, it's in the existing space of possibilities. It's just that, it's really how do you map that space to the actions you want to take or your goals, decide what you want to do to satisfy your goals. So in this discussion we're having, it's really the only goal is to use the English word bird and mammal correctly. And so, that's what you're building, knowledge structures, splitting up the space of possibilities to correctly achieve that end. And so, I think you could describe it in sort of, more grandiose language, but I think that's all, these concepts are, or all there is to it, really.
A feature of forming concepts or of abstracting things in general is that you lose details that are irrelevant to the concept, right? So, for a bat, for instance, it wouldn't necessarily matter that the bat was hungry on a Tuesday, right? And if that was your one example of the bat, and you have 40 different examples of bats now, and being hungry on a Tuesday is irrelevant with respect to the concept of a bat. And I'm wondering if, well, you've described how episodic and semantic knowledge can blur into each other during that process of losing irrelevant details. Can you just describe that for us?
Yeah, it's funny. Way back when we formalized this idea, I thought this would upset people. Basically, it says that everything, just like you said, everything starts out as an episode, and then it gets interfered with related experiences if they collapse together in memory, and becomes a little bit. There's no magical point, but over time it becomes more semantic in nature. Mac's actually written this up as a focused on this aspect of kind of going from episodes to semantic knowledge, and it's been kind of fleshed out, this idea. But yeah, it's exactly that. And these models do a really good job of accounting for human recognition ratings. So it's you're saying, if things sort of collapse together into the same cluster in memory, you have some knowledge, but you basically have sort of almost the histogram of your experiences. You don't have this bat was exactly, at this location. This one was at that location. It was this shade of gray versus that shade of gray. It's just sort of all averaged together in memory. I mean, but that's, just sort of our days all blur together, unless a person in a gorilla suit bursts into the classroom or something, and that'll probably get separated off as its own episode because of the surprise. But yeah, so that's basically it. It's just you just basically are doing this intersection, averaging operation on your experiences until that sort of collapsing of information together leads to a problem. So you assume everything's simple and can just be kept together as a running average pretty much. And when that fails, you take note, and then that could become a new running average in your head. So it's all about you're doing some kind of task, you're trying to have some kind of goal, and when the way you're thinking about things isn't working, you take note, and that could just keep in mind as an exception, or that could kind of turn into something more semantic as time goes on.
Can clusters get destroyed?
Yeah, it's really good question. It's funny, way back, when I was a graduate student making this model, I was looking at.
It's funny. Everything is way back then. When it's so interesting how this is a very separate. And I'm sorry to interject, but it seems so many people have this experience that whatever their careers are. They're 50 years into their career, but everything was pretty much set. The roadmap was set by something that happened really early on. It's pretty rare that someone late in their career starts a new path. It's like there's a few crucial years in there, and then boom, it's all set for the future. So I don't know.
Funny. I think I hit my high point as an undergraduate, actually.
Yeah, there you go.
But literally my first publication, which gets no credit, was exactly PageRank 3 years before PageRank. So I should have just stopped there or something.
Wow. Yeah.
It didn't even get the best student paper award at the conference. I don't know what you got to do.
You were too early.
Yeah, I guess. I don't know. But I mean, that's true. But I think I'd be better off if I actually did that. I kind of get into too many things. And then, I mean, right now, I mean, I don't want to change the conversation, but like right now, we're trying to we're still working with these models. And like the only reason we kind of stick with this general theory is because it seems like it's like
Works.
correct. And, but there's a lot of things that I do and try and things kind of move away. And I mean, I don't know, maybe we can talk what's going on currently, but even moving towards like model-based neuroscience was like very different. It was really like, I guess my philosophy for neuroscience is that you should take like the best cognitive model of the task that explains behavior and kind of use that to work with to kind of figure out what the brain's doing. So like if someone else had a better model of the kind of tasks we were running, well, then I would have just used, their model. So,
right.
Yeah, but I think there is like some truth, but I don't know. I get bored and always want to switch it up anyway. But yeah.
I also recently talked to Paul Chisek, and he and others like Yuri Buzaki, they have this push where they say we have it all wrong. That our labels for cognition, our concepts, if you will, are all wrong and actually have been for centuries. Concepts like attention, decision-making, and so on. And then we're going to have to reconceive of and relabel what we're actually studying because the concepts are wrong, essentially. The labels are wrong. Do you think there's any merit to that? And more generally, are we, as humans, are we too concept trigger happy? Like, can our bias to form concepts, it seems like this is a bias that we have. Like we want to compartmentalize everything and give a label to it, right? Is that bias to form concepts, if it does indeed exist, does that lead us astray, when we're in a realm of unknown or poorly theoretically formed domain, like something like studying brains and minds?
I like this idea that we might have like the all wrong sort of like frameworks for discussing everything. Yeah. I mean, one reason, this might sound cavalier, but like in some sense, these discussions don't really like inform or affect my research because when I use words like concept, attention, like I'm very specific. I've got like a formal model, and like if someone says, that's not attention, it's okay, just whatever you want to call this weight that follows this rule that explains behavior across 30 studies, fine, you could call it gobbledygooky, whatever. Like it doesn't, I think so. I don't really know if coming up with like new ontologies of this, like maybe we should just actually be a little bit more specific in what we mean or what we're claiming. I mean, it's almost like back to the model selection discussion we had earlier. So I think these are like good things to think about and debate. But I mean, I hate to say this because I know everybody doesn't like modeling or like formal descriptions, but unfortunately, I think it's really necessary for dealing with these sort of complex like issues.
I'm not sure that everyone doesn't like them. I think that they sort of dominate neuroscience these days.
All right. Well, about time. Just kidding.
Yeah. Well, it's interesting because, I'm reading, having read now about your sustain model. I think, that's good. This, and it's, you kind of forget that when you developed sustain, and we're approaching things using cognitive models, that was not the rule of the day. It seems more like the rule of the day now, how to approach things. Do you experience that? Do you have that same outlook?
Yeah, maybe like my previous comments are just like reflecting like this time period I imprinted on. But yeah, like when I was way back, like in the dark ages, like people in psychology were like, running like 2x2 studies and doing ANOVAs. And there wasn't like a lot of mass psych type people were like in a real minority and were just like considered like boring and pointless for the most part, even though they were doing a lot of times very interesting and useful work.
Now that you say that, I actually I have this recollection even in graduate school, and I really came in very naive. Like my undergrad wasn't related to my graduate school, but I had this recollection of, it seemed like everything that we were studying, there was like a model being built for it, and I was like, oh God, now I have to learn all the modeling stuff too, and it seemed heavy and hard, and maybe that was when modeling was coming on as such a ubiquitous frame
Yeah,
tool.
it could be. That's really interesting perspective. Yeah, but from the other side, like applying these models, simple models like the ones I work with, they're not like, like all these spiking neurons and like tons of
Right,
details
right.
or like membranes. Like people are just like, those models aren't real. That's just like fantasy world. Why would you use this? So it's like basically both sides. The psychologists are like, oh, please don't make me like listen to your boring talk about this stuff. I just show me just show me the mirror test or something, or I don't know, something like
It's not biologically plausible. Is that the?
oh yeah, it wasn't. I don't know if they cared about that. Actually, it's really funny. There was almost like a completely different perspective. There was like a perspective then that's, I think it's just sort of died out like as people like retire and stuff. That like cognitive psychology was at like a functional level that the brain was completely irrelevant. I mean, I know it's
Right.
hard to believe now, but that was like a huge, and there was like, popular philosophers at the time like Fodor, like pushing it. I mean, there's still like a lot of people that
Yeah,
feel
it's still
that
there.
way, but
Yeah.
but they're not like part of, this community, and it's like a ever, decreasing minority. Yeah. So, I mean, it's kind of nice that people appreciate models. I mean, of course, models could clarify, they could also obscure, and just having a model, it's only, like you do model-based work, it's only as good as the model is. So, if you use the model as a lens on the brain and, that lens is flawed or distorted, then so are all your results. So it's not like a cure-all, but it could help incorporate other constraints, like especially if the model is like justified from other studies to, lead to a better result. But it's nice it's nice that people are coming around to this a bit more.
Yeah. All right. Well, I want to ask about the hippocampus, and then we'll move on to a little
Sure.
more deep learning work, because it seems like the hippocampus these days is associated with everything. We've just been talking about it in terms of concepts, forming concepts, but the latest craze in hippocampal research is its association with navigation. I should say latest. It's not really late. It's been around for a long time, but so does two questions. Do concepts co-opt our navigation system or vice versa? And what does the hippocampus do?
That's funny. Yeah. So way back in like ancient times when I was thinking about like how this clustering model is staying grafted on the mind, I just viewed like it all as the same learning problem, like learning about space. Space
Right.
is just like another concept to learn. And like I was really kind of like scared to say that. At one point I crossed paths with Lynn Nadell, and I thought he would like hate it. He's like, "Oh no, that seems okay." And maybe like just over time getting confidence and like having a good postdoc that wanted to do a deep dive into these issues of like navigation and hippocampus. Like we finally like published something recently on this. But yeah, so I think like obviously people like use space to like organize their thoughts at times. Like we even in like natural language, you say like I'm feeling up today, I'm feeling down. We understand abstract concepts like time in terms of space, but that's just like using representations of space. That's not like a learning system or a system at all in the brain. So I think there's really just like one general clustering learning system that supports learning concepts, and space is just another concept. It's a very, in some ways, limited concept of how it's like studied like in rodents in the lab. Yeah, so I guess really neither. It's just like there's just sort of like one computation, one learning system to rule it all, and you change the inputs, you change the task, and you get out things that look like Jennifer Aniston or like I don't know, like a rodent enclosure.
What? Yeah. What about memory? Doesn't the hippocampus do memory?
Yeah, I mean, there's like, okay, yeah. So the hippocampus does even more than you mentioned. Like, it comes up in like kind of almost like simulation, like imagination.
Imagination.
Yeah, like people call like mental time travel and stuff. But yeah, but I mean, I see these clustering studies that we do. That I mean, it is of course a kind of memory. It's persistent. Like over like our studies only go on like 2 hours, but in terms of like long-term memory, like I said before, we really don't like. There's all kinds of ideas in terms of consolidation involving the hippocampus, and I think you've discussed on your podcast like complementary learning systems, and of course that's contentious. So there's debates about that.
Right.
I mostly focus on sort of like the acquisition of knowledge and like don't like wade too deeply. I mean, I find it really interesting into the consolidation aspects. I mean, I find that reasonable given how, again, like how much cell turnover there is in the hippocampus. But yeah, so I kind of view the concept learning as like encompassing memory as well, because it's like, again, each cluster starts out as an episodic memory, which the hippocampus is implicated in. And it only becomes more semantic when you have a bunch of kind of like similar, almost like redundant experiences that interfere with each other and like sort of wash out the unique aspects of the episode that create something more semantic. And, you know, I think just like learning a location in space, like a place cell does, that's just a concept of like collapsing together a bunch of related viewpoints and experiences, sights and smells and sounds, like the geometry of the room, like basically just like a lot of inputs that are non-surprising and could collapse together into one cluster for that location. So I think all this stuff is like really the same thing.
Well, so just to be super nitpicky, because I did have Paul Chisek on a little while ago, and I really enjoy his it's called a phylogenetic refinement approach, but basically looking through, you know, tracing back our evolutionary history to better explain and ask better questions about what brain areas are doing and why they're doing it and how they're doing it and stuff. And he didn't really talk about hippocampus and, you know, abstraction and concept learning much, but I was kind of trying to apply his thought process to this, and in the whole navigation versus cognitive map versus concepts and abstract conceptual space maps, you know, and, you know, thinking about the chicken and egg problem of these things. And I thought, so I looked back and at the evolutionary development of the hippocampus. I promise I won't take us too far down this road.
No,
but,
please.
So early on, you know, before the explosion of the cortex, it kind of came out of the hypothalamus, and which is like a regulatory overall control system essentially, and the hippocampus is kind of related to the explore aspect of the explore exploit trade-off, and can be associated with this longer range exploration mechanisms. And I thought, okay, if that's true, like if the hippocampus was sort of developed built on top of some system that was used for exploring to find food and resources and long-range exploration. And I thought, okay, that's related to navigation, and that's kind of related to the cognitive map. And that's not so far from then sort of internalizing these things into abstract concepts. So like a conceptual space, you know, for essentially you can think of it as still being used for super long-range behavioral purposes. And in that sense is a bit of a navigation, long-range exploration way of saying what a concept is. Does that sound ridiculous?
I mean,
we can
not any more ridiculous.
Yeah.
I mean, I don't know. Yeah. Evolutionary psychologists have all kinds of descriptions of why we're the way we are too.
Yeah, sure.
But I mean, no, I'm not. No, I like these stories. I guess, like, yeah. I mean, I think it's valuable to think about, like, you know, where these things came from. But I mean, also like there's all kinds of like was it glucocorticoid receptors, like stress response? Was it? I can't remember. I remember reading about all this stuff, like HBA axis, like why if you get like sometimes memory problems if you have like people with depression or something. I think this is why. But I mean, my reading on this is all out of date. So there's all kinds of like weird things that go on. But I mean, one thing I kind of focus on is just kind of like what kind of computation, because you're trying to pull out something more abstract, like more general to like what it's doing. And I totally like am on board with that program. So for me, what's more general is that the hippocampus has the ability to like basically bind together like arbitrary elements that are relevant in the situation. Like the bad example, you just like, why a fur doesn't go with flying and wings? And you're just like, boom, you could just do it. You know, it has this ability to put things together, which would be really useful too. Like you mentioned, if you're exploring a new environment, you have to remember where like the squirrel hid its, you know, acorns or something. But yeah, so I mean, it's also like why it would be useful for imagination or mental simulation or, you know, all these sort of functions that are associated with it, or episodic memory. I mean, you could like encounter any event and have to remember it's like totally arbitrary.
Right.
So like, I think that's and it's also like an area that's working, with like medial prefrontal cortex to do this, where you have to kind of figure out what's relevant and orient. So yeah, it just seems like it has the ability to like learn arbitrary things, almost like build new codes or something. So
Right.
that would be useful while you're exploring. But I mean, I don't know. I kind of mostly just focus on the kind of computation it does, and it seems like it links together all these different domains that are associated with the hippocampus.
Last question about clustering and concept formation, and then we'll move on, I promise.
Sure.
I thought, I have like a billion more questions about these things, and I'm sure you've already, you thought of these things as you were probably 11 years old, but
Nah.
I thought, maybe, is it possible that the development of expertise in a domain is just whereas other people might conceive of some, I don't know, let's say piano playing or, whatever expertise domain. There's piano playing, and that's kind of like one cluster, right? But then once you start to really go through your 10,000 hours of practice, is that maybe just a process of forming more clusters where, having different conceptions, whereas other people kind of would have them as fewer clusters to conceive of the same concept?
Yeah, I mean, I think that could be part of the story. Like a lot of, even when I was working on this model originally, I was thinking about the expertise literature, like kind of work that like James Tanaka and others were doing at the time. And like experts tend to draw, there's all kinds of experts, of course, but like if you take like experts in some perceptual task, like bird watchers or something, they tend to form like finer gradations and like whatever the concepts, the distinctions they could draw. And so certainly you'd need sort of more partitions, more like clusters in memory to support that. But I think like what really drives a lot of expertise is like kind of changing the space that the clusters themselves would reside in. So like experts seem to have access to like more and more useful features to describe things. So like, if we're playing chess, like I'm not a chess expert, it's just like board positions, but a chess expert could see like, oh, this is like this attacking position, or like, I think this is also, we talked about memory being very superficial. This is why experts are better in their domain, but not outside their domain, is because they have better indexes to their knowledge. So like when they see something, just like as we become like expert in neuroscience, we have better indexes of people's work. And so we could relate them to each other and retrieve them relevant work more easily, as opposed to rely just on superficial things. So I think the experts change the space. But one nice thing about clustering model, at least sustain, I think it's actually unusual this way. It's one finding I wanted to go after originally, is that when items in a domain become more distinctive, as they would be for an expert that has like a richer featural description, a richer space, the benefits of abstraction in the model actually go down. And so there's like a processing advantage to forming more clusters, like you're saying. So it would actually be like adaptive, according to the model, to like have more clusters when like all the birds look really distinct from each other. Whereas to me, they're just birds because I'm not a bird expert. So I could just class them together. Yeah.
Yeah. Birds. I don't know. I'm not a bird expert either. I don't understand bird experts. I like them just fine. I know you don't like them because you don't like anything.
I don't know. As long as they don't like Friends, it's okay.
Okay. All right. Let's, it's fascinating stuff to me. That's why I keep asking more and more questions. But you've been using deep learning lately. So, there's this deep learning explosion, and it's kind of colored everything in cognitive science, neuroscience, and you've been using deep learning a few different ways lately. One thing that you've done is you've connected concept learning to different layers in a convolutional neural network. The convolutional neural networks that are used to model, as you mentioned earlier, our ventral visual stream, which underlies our ability to recognize objects. So how do you use convolutional neural networks to better understand concept learning and how it connects with the ventral visual stream?
Yeah, no, thanks for asking. First, I think these networks are like a complete like game changer for the kind of research I do. So like this, like your question is great. I'm going to answer with this step even like further back. With all these like clustering models, all these cognitive models they rely on the fiction of that the experimenter has to say how people represent things. So you have to say, oh, that's a triangle, that's small, that's red. You have to like write out the features. Whereas like that's like a real hard part of the conceptual problem is like, how do you create like a description language? How do you come up with the features? And that's really like in the previous era of machine learning, what made a model good is having good features. Like, we talk about experts having better features. So in some way, like the most interesting problem has been like sidestepped, by necessity, like, because you don't know you can't like posit like what the representations are. So like deep learning can, if you just train something on the image net, could like pull out like reasonable features itself from the end-to-end like optimization. And it's really exciting because it's just not one feature. It's like you just mentioned, there's all kinds of levels of representation, of transformations of like the image to the response. And so like, one thing it did with Olivia Guest that, we're still working on is like looking at animal learning, like pigeon learning. So they could do all these things that people say, oh, that's so abstract, that's so conceptual, but there's a lot of cases where like, we kind of infer abilities that maybe aren't there in animals, and probably with people too. I mean, probably in developmental studies of children, like we go, oh, look, they have a sense of object permanence or this. I mean, who knows? I mean, they're well-designed studies, but people read so much into things, or like the mirror test, like, oh, like you put a dot on a baby's head and it recognizes it. Yeah, and dolphins could do it, but then, oh, so can some stupid fish. So maybe that's not a good test anymore. And going on a bit, but like the same thing happens in deep learning, like, oh, look, this could detect cancer. And maybe it just turned out that all the serious cases were sent to like a certain machine that has some artifact in it that like the deep learning model picked up on. So even though it generalizes to the test set has the same sort of confound in it, and it doesn't like work well in practice. So anyways, it's a long way around this is like by modeling concept learning using different levels of representation from the deep learning model, we could ask, are people or pigeons relying on like very low level, almost like pixel-like information to solve a task, or are they doing something more, deeper, based on sort of features that are a little bit more conceptual and not as like image bound? So that's like one thing we're doing.
Yeah, well, I guess the way that we sort of think about it and, the eventual visual stream classically is, light comes in the retina, you're looking at a bat, let's say, and then our visual cortex starts to break it down into all these tiny features, and then hierarchically it gets passed to other areas of the brain, and they get built up in more and more complex features. And then finally, there's the representation of a bat in our brain, right? And sort of, I think that the next logical thing to do then is to think, okay, that's the representation that we'll use to form the concept of a bat then. We'll take that final step. And I guess what your work is showing here is that that's not necessarily how it needs to be done. And that's one of the questions, I suppose.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know. Maybe like, I think I'm like too much of like a hard ass or something. Like, so I wouldn't think of the end as being like the concept. I mean, maybe it's just like of course you're losing information. Like, what is it? The information processing inequality. You're using like information at every stage. You're really just transforming it to get to like the response to the action. But like what you said's totally right. So like we could model like what, it's just really a question of like, are the animals using something like more like processed or higher level, or can you actually just solve this task like in the stupidest way, like basically like like associating responses with like what's coming off your retina? And like maybe for like modeling human learning and animal learning, this would be like a good methodology, is to like use tasks where you could apply a model to it and like quantify like what kind of information is necessary to solve the task. Because all these things look so impressive from the outside, like, oh, animals could do this, animals could do that, but it could be just picking up on some like really superficial property of the images, just like how deep learning models look for shortcuts, and so you got to go through all these efforts to like make sure it's just not picking up on texture or something. I think it's the same issue
Right.
that like it's just not deep learning. I think it's people and animals. We're just not that abstract. Like we were talking earlier, we'll just look for like whatever shortcut to like get to the answer.
Yeah, I mean, abstraction is costly. So if there is a better way to do it in a dumb way, that's actually the smart way to do it, I suppose.
Yeah, I mean, like also like how do you? We say abstraction, everyone like complains, oh, this is just curve fitting and this, like, how do you infer like the correct distribution that has something to do with the training distribution? Like, is like, what magic is that? It either has to be like built in your head or you have to experience it. I mean, I just think we have rich environments and like a lot of extensive interactions, like with fairly rich inputs that like force us to build like somewhat robust representations. But like, I don't know, like, I really hate this like curve fitting complaint because it's like I don't really know like what kind of learning is possible here.
Is that bad?
You either have to, you either have to build in like the constraints. I don't know. It's just there's just no magic.
And that's the show. Thanks everybody for joining us. No, I'm just kidding. We're not going to end it with there's just no magic. But
It's just it's not so sad. It's just like, oh, where's the wizard?
Yeah, I know. That's one thing. Again, just the more you learn, the more magic goes away in your thinking, and which is great in some respects because it's better to understand things. But once you realize there is no tooth fairy, it's less magical. And I don't know. There's something less special about that, but it's something even more special about learning how things actually work. So I don't know.
Yeah.
There's a trade-off. But
Definitely.
yeah. But just to get us back on track here.
Sure.
So you kind of set it up. So what'd you guys do?
That work, we just actually found that pigeons are pretty much just learning from pixels.
They're good radiologists still.
Yeah, unless you like change some superficial property of the images, and then I don't know, maybe it's inconclusive, right? Because we're just their behavior is consistent with like having a deep understanding of the images, or just none at all.
Just to actually say what you did on the technical front with the deep learning
Sure,
network,
sure.
you basically tested out. You took out different layers from the convolutional neural network and used those different layers to see what matched up best with what the pigeons were actually using to do their radiologist work, right?
Yeah, definitely. It's straight back to like sort of the model selection story. So basically, you could make a bunch of like concept learning models that are working on different representations, different input representations. And like you said, you could either work on visual representations that are incredibly low level, like very close to the stimulus, or you could work on ones that are like, very high level in like through many levels of processing. And it turns out that the lower level ones support the behavior of the pigeons, which look like impressive on the face of it, but it's really maybe not.
Okay, so that's one way that you've been using deep learning, and we're only going to. I mean, you've been doing a lot of different things actually, but I just want to bring in one more at least. So you've said that your recent work with adding top-down attention to a convolutional neural network is basically an attempt to make deep learning more human. So what do you mean by that, and how do you implement top-down attention in convolutional neural networks? Because there's a lot of talk these days about attention and adding attention to networks, and attention is all you need. And and this goes back to what attention is, and that there are about 10,000 different meanings about attention. But how do you implement top-down attention?
Sure. Yeah. I mean, you're absolutely right. There's like 10,000 different versions of attention. Actually, I think just like a couple of days ago, like a review paper on how attention is used in neuroscience and AI came out from Grace Lindsay, who's done some work on attention and deep learning. But so for like, if there's any hardcore like machine learning people listening, like the way we use attention has nothing to do with like the transformer architectures you mentioned. We're really kind of talking about a kind of selective attention that picks out what's relevant given your current goal or expectation. And this goal or expectation is coming from outside, like the deep learning network is coming from outside the ventral stream or the stimulus itself. So like, for example, if you were looking for your keys, it's like you want to like almost reconfigure your visual system on the fly to prioritize like filters in your visual system that respond to shiny things and small things. Whereas if you're looking for your cat, you would like reconfigure a different way. So that's how we see top-down attention as sort of like a layer or multiple layers that are kind of like multiplicatively like weight the filters. So basically silence some that are irrelevant that just add noise given the current expectations and like make others sort of more consequential in the computation. Like say if there was like one that was related to how shiny the thing is or something, the texture, if you're looking for your keys. Yeah, so we train up these attention weights for different goals at different intensities and like look at this trade-off, and we find that we could increase sensitivity measured in terms of D prime. So basically just be better for like moderate levels of attention, but you also get like rising bias. So like just like people, if you're like, if there's those things like, oh, I see faces everywhere, like those funny websites, it's sort of like if you're looking for something, you're more likely to see it. So you see this kind of bias or criterion shift in signal detection terms also happen. So as you turn up attention more and more, you kind of get this like trade-off and eventually like things fall apart.
The way that you implemented this though is, correct me if I'm wrong, did you take a fully trained convolutional neural network and then add in a extra layer into the network that was the attention layer that you were just talking about, that then you could then train, keeping everything else the same? Is that right?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's critical because, like when you're looking for your keys, your visual system's getting modulated, but it's not like permanently changing that much as a consequence of the task. So like we kind of viewed like these pre-trained network as sort of like your generic building up all the filters, all the feature detectors, like kind of getting representative experience, almost like you want to hotwire that system on the fly to repurpose it for more specific tasks that are relevant in hand. And I mean, you could get into it, but this is like really kind of follows from like some just model-based fMRI work we've done. Yeah, so yeah, it's exactly how it works. Right now, we're like, we have like a preprint up now, and we're working on newer work. We actually like work on a whole like separate attentional network that still relies on a pre-trained convolutional neural network to do the object recognition, but has a whole new network that does the top-down modulation that could support generalization. So that, so if you know how to like look for like lions and tigers, you probably also know what to look for a liger, even if you've never done that task before. And we also could like interface it with language. So like if someone says to you like, look at the black bird in the tree, that'll like get transformed into like basically change the ventral stream to configure for that message coming to you. Yeah, so it's kind of cool. I think it's what people do. And we see the same kind of things like in our concept learning studies. If there are fewer aspects of the stimulus that are relevant to the discrimination, to like solving the concept learning problem, we actually see like the dimensionality of representations in like the mid-level visual system, like in lateral occipital cortex, are smaller. So we have like this technique for measuring dimensionality of neural representations, and this neuroimage paper with Christian Aldenheim from a few years ago. Yeah, so you can see this like kind of task-related modulation that is kind of exactly like how we're doing it in the deep learning model, like where you kind of just change the dimensionality of the problem and silence the irrelevant filters. And this isn't spatial attention, this is like futural attention.
Right. Right.
But yeah, so I think this is what goes on. I mean, I think this is just the goal, or the relevancy is coming all the way down from like ventral medial prefrontal cortex, and it's signals going all the way down to like kind of change these visual representations that are coming on up to the hippocampus and other places. So that's like the rough sort of cartoon conception of what's going on.
I'm pretty sure you're cited in Grace Lindsay's recent. I haven't read the whole thing yet, but I'm pretty sure that she cites your work in there.
Well, it must be a really good review paper then.
It's excellent. What are your? I mean, so part of your point in this paper is that in machine learning, in AI, the focus of attention is basically almost all bottom up, and so what you're doing here is this top down attention to sort of drive the system, highlight some weights, and get rid of others. Well, what are your thoughts on the state of adding attention into deep learning?
I mean, I think there's no reason like not to. So like, I mean, just like with all the caveats that you've mentioned before, that there's many different varieties of attention, and we have to be clear about what aspects of attention we're examining. But like, at least for like what we're doing, like I think we have it pretty well worked out, like how this kind of selective attention works in like areas that are of interest to us, like medial prefrontal cortex, the hippocampus, and along areas in the ventral stream. I think it's ready to start trying out ideas. It's not too soon. And if anything, it's like by trying out these ideas and these networks, I think we'll probably get like more insight into like what the brain might be doing, and it might spur like further understanding onto the neuroscience side. So I think it could be the right point to like kind of get that virtuous cycle that people, like to discuss in terms of neuroscience and AI research.
You've said that deep learning is, you consider it a game changer. And I mean, is this just something like where it's a candy store for you and you think, oh, I can, you have like 10 different ideas of how you can start using deep networks to interact with your concept learning systems and so forth?
Oh, yeah. I mean, I kind of almost wish I was like born later or something so that I had more years to like play with these things, just because like, right. I mean, just the changes in computing, like the models really aren't like that much different than like the 80s. There's just like a couple insights and good tricks, but like it's just finally like come together that you could do interesting things. And to me, it's just so exciting that not to have to work with handcrafted, experimenter defined representations. I mean, I don't think people would believe what I'm going to say, but like we used to sit around in graduate school, like in the late 90s, and with professors and students and talk about the big picture. And like everybody thought it would be 200 years before we had any models that could like do object recognition, like even decently from pixels. And like all the research, I wasn't doing any vision science then, but all the researchers saw like all their studies and all the minutia of our findings is like feeding into like some eventual understanding that would be like so far into the future. I mean, that was so ridiculously wrong. And it's just like, it's very exciting to see that. I mean, the same could be said for like even like speech understanding, and I mean, face recognition would be like not even imaginable. And like, so like when people like don't get excited about this stuff, I think it's just like a case of like moving the goalposts, or they just, I don't know. I mean, this is what the history of AI too. Like things like sorting, which I keep mentioning, used to be considered like AI. I saw a talk like forever ago by Ray Mooney. It's basically anything that works is no longer AI.
There's a name. It's called the AI effect, I believe.
Yeah.
It was termed the AI effect. But that's interesting that you say that, because most people are way short-sighted in their estimates of, for instance, when will we have AGI? When will we have figured out the brain? And it's always 20 to 30 years away. And that was true 100 years ago, and it's true today. So it's interesting that you had that different perspective on how quickly this seems to have happened.
I mean, I don't know. It's really exciting. It kind of goes what we were saying, like maybe everything isn't really that complicated. I mean, it turns out like obviously like we're not done with vision, and it's these models are like
right.
Have huge hiccups, but I think maybe we really weren't that far off. Like it could be like going back to our other conversations. Maybe it's about like the complexity of interactions, the richness of the input. It's like the theories weren't really that bad actually, and the stuff kind of works, even though it's pretty, brain dead. Like a lot of the models, it's
yeah. So you see, okay, so you use the phrase game changer, and I don't want to harp on that, but, projecting forward, let's say, 20 to 30 years, or maybe 200 years, like you were saying before, looking back on this latest, what's called the deep learning revolution, how will history view it? Will we see it as having been an essential leap forward toward understanding our own intelligence, or toward understanding intelligence in general? Or is it going to, I'll leave it open to you. How will history view this time?
Yeah, sure. So, I mean, I could imagine like your guests that are astute would probably like give the quick history lesson. I'll try to do it really fast, not to be tedious. I mean, people go back to like Rosenblatt, who was a psychologist that made the perceptron, and like it was the same thing. It was pretty much like linear regression with batch size 1, and the U.S. Navy, like I think it was USA piled money into it and built like like a hardware version of it, and it's fine. But like all the newspaper articles, it was the same hype in like the late 50s.
Yep.
Is now like, oh, super intelligent machine, and of course like it flamed out because it was just kind of it's basically just doing like linear regression, and there's devastating attacks from Minsky. But then of course then there's this like whatever winter, and then backpropagation was actually discovered much earlier. I mean, it makes sense. It's just like high school mathematics. It's like the chain rule, like big deal.
Yeah.
It's like, anyway, it was popularized again in the 80s, and then now we could solve X or a nonlinear problem, something beyond linear regression, and it took off. But then, of course, I went away, at least in my opinion, because it was it was kind of hackish, just like how deep learning is now. But and like kernel methods, like support vector machines, and even Bayesian methods, like seemed like they had a lot of advantages. So then it just kind of went away a lot. But I guess the difference is now this stuff actually like works in a way it doesn't before. And so I think how it's viewed will just depend a lot, like how the labels maintain or change. Like you said before, like, oh, everything's just like labeled deep learning. So like maybe we start getting better representations of uncertainty in these models or this. But I mean, unlike before and like all these other AI winters, like these models actually do like interesting tests now, and people are making like money off these models. Like that's maybe not of interest to academics,
right?
But it's a difference with the like previous waves. So like, yeah, I don't really think it'll bust. And like how it's viewed, it's just like, history is like, whoever's writing the history like determines it. But like, I can't see the stuff not leading to the next thing that makes a huge difference. And of course, like neuroscience is so fad driven. Like by the time people start doing really super amazing neuroscience with these models, we probably will have moved on and like underappreciate their work or something and rediscover it later.
Yeah. Oh, it's amazing how often that sort of thing happens. I really appreciate you talking to me for so long. So thanks, Brad.
Oh, no, it's great talking with you, Paul. Thank you.
Brain Inspired is a production of me and you. You can support the show through Patreon for a microscopic $2 or $4 per month. Go to braininspired.co and find the red Patreon button there. Your contribution will help sustain and improve the show and prohibit any annoying advertisements like you hear on other shows. To get in touch with me, email paul@braininspired.co. The music you hear is by The New Year. Find them at thenewyear.net. Thanks for your support. See you next time.